What is up, guys? It's your buddy Blue Spooky here with another daily video. Your standard 1 hour and 30-minute affair. If you guys end up enjoying this video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any thoughts about the stories in this video, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as one of my favorite things about doing these videos is reading your guys' comments, even if I can't always respond to them. Last but not least, if you'd like to go that extra step and support the channel even more than you do by just watching the video already, go ahead and click that join button next to the subscribe button. It's $2 a month at the lowest tier, and you get a special icon next to your name when you comment, and special emoticons that you can use when you comment as well. No content will be locked behind the paywall, of course. It's simply something extra you can do if you'd like to support the channel a little more. Either way, I will get right into the video, and I hope you guys enjoy the true scary stories. Thanks for watching. For a bit of context, I need to explain how transportation works in the area where I live. So where I live, public transportation is absolute dog shit. There's only one not very reliable public bus that takes you in and out of the residential area. It's a long way walking too, so the people in this area came up with a cab sort of system. You pay by the seat, so one of the cabs fits up to 4 people. A little under a year ago, they decided to identify these cabs with a sticker and a number that states that the car is part of the cab line. The drivers are also required to have an ID that has the cab line info. Now, on to the story. A couple of times, men have tried to offer me a ride. I try my best to ignore them, but sometimes it can be a little bit scary. The part of the residential area where I live is very isolated, so not a lot of cars or people go through there. I have to walk alone from my house to the cab line and bus stop because of this. At one time, a couple of months ago, I was walking from my house to the stop, wearing my headphones, so not really paying much attention. That was my first mistake on my part. All of a sudden, a car pulled over right next to me. This wasn't that strange, really. I've been using this cab line for a while, and a lot of the drivers know me personally. If they see me, sometimes they'll pull over so I don't have to walk all the way to the stop. The driver said, "Hey, are you going to my place of destination?" I said yes and got into the car without checking the windshield for the ID number. That was the second mistake on my part. Here is where the alarms started going off in my head. First, a lot of the cars in the line tend to be older cars with no AC. This was a newer car, so right when I got in, he locked all the doors. At this point, I finally realized this wasn't one of the cabs I knew, but instead a complete stranger. He began interrogating me over things, exactly where I lived, all sorts of things. I responded as vaguely as possible, with my heart now beating really fast. I was starting to panic, so I texted a friend my location and told him to call me ASAP. At this point, we were getting closer to the destination, and the man was not slowing down the car at all. He just drove right past my stop when the call came through from my friend. I started to talk to him like he was my boyfriend. "Hi, baby. I'm almost there, so wait for me, and we'll go together, okay?" My friend was really confused, but when the man heard my conversation, he suddenly stopped the car right in the middle of the street. "Oh, sorry. I was so entertained talking to you that I almost passed by. We'll be seeing each other again." He unlocked the car and I bolted out, barely saying a word to acknowledge him. After that day, I became much more aware of my surroundings, and I tend to only get inside the cabs at the stop unless I clearly see the ID of the car or know the person inside. A couple of my friends said I was just overreacting, but that event really scared the shit out of me. Then today arrives. I was walking from my house to the stop as usual. No headphones this time though. I was about halfway there when a car started driving slowly next to me. I kept on walking, and the older man that was driving before started to talk to me through the window. "Hey, are you Alicia's daughter by chance?" "You live around here, right?" I responded I was not, and kept on walking. He kept on insisting though that he was my neighbor, and he would give me a ride to my destination. I replied again he had mistaken me, and I didn't want a ride from him. Mind you, my mom was not called that, and has been dead for over a decade. My grandma, that sometimes people confused as my mom, was not called that either. I began walking faster as he followed me, approaching the stop where there were more people. At this point, the man became extremely angry and started to yell at me in front of everyone. He screamed that this was the last time he would be so nice about this to me. Then he sped up and left. Finally, I got to the stop to get inside a cab, and they took me to my destination. When I got to work, I told my boss what happened. She said, "Thank God you kept on walking, you would have been kidnapped." And yeah, that was my morning today. I really need to get myself a car in case that guy comes back around. Often during the hot summers of the mid and late 80s, I would spend some time at my cousin's house. We both lived in rural areas, but staying with his family was considerably better than staying with mine. My cousin Clay and I had a lot of things in common and would do a lot of fun things together in the summer. We would watch scary movies on VHS, play one-on-one baseball, and go out hiking in the woods. My aunt even had a really old typewriter, and the two of us would crowd around it and write really bad, scary stories together. My uncle and aunt both worked evening jobs, so they wouldn't be there at night. My uncle was a park ranger, and my aunt was the manager of a grocery store. We had supervision during the day if we were at home. We usually weren't, except at meal times though. At night, we stayed in and watched videos or did things like that. We rarely, if ever, would go out and do anything at nighttime. The area we lived in was very safe though, so if we did, we never really had anything to worry about. I wouldn't say though that the area they lived in was an area where everyone knew each other or anything like that. In town, it would be a much different story. Whenever we went down to town, whether it was to go to the store or go to the swimming pool, everyone knew each other. But outside, at the house, it was completely different. This Saturday night, we were going to be home by ourselves for quite a long time, longer than usual even. We had a fun ride in the back of my uncle's pickup truck into town to rent some movies and get some candy and soda to prepare. It was nearly an hour ride from the town to the house in the country, and we always enjoyed being in the bed of the truck. It was still light outside when both of Clay's parents went to work, so the two of us decided to go for a quick walk down the road. I don't really remember too much about the walk itself. When we got home though, we decided to have some snacks and get started with our movie binging. Being summer, it was still light outside for quite a while. We were sitting in the living room together watching a movie when we both noticed something. A truck seemed to be coming down the road. It stopped and turned into our driveway. Clay didn't recognize this truck at all, and it didn't pull all the way up to the house either. He got up and let me know he was going to go outside and see who this was. Clay walked out the front door and onto the porch. As soon as he opened the door though, I watched the truck shoot off in reverse and begin pulling out of the driveway. It pulled back and shot down the road, heading the same direction it had come from. Clay went back inside, and we both decided it was simply someone using the driveway to turn around. We kept watching the movie and didn't pay much more mind to that incident. The night went on and the sun eventually went down. Clay and I kept watching movies, and since we were relatively young, we were getting really scared from watching them. Of course, boys our age would never admit to such a thing though. A bit later, we both began to hear some noises outside. We also saw some light shining in through the front windows of the house. We got up together and went to look outside, looking out the window. It was dark enough outside that we could notice the light shining right into the house, but we couldn't make out what the vehicle was. We did notice it seemed to have stopped in the exact place the truck from earlier had. We began talking to each other about whether or not it might be the same person. We expected the truck to pull out and turn around, much like the one from earlier did, but that didn't happen right away. In fact, nothing seemed to happen. The truck remained in place, with the light shining in through the windows. Clay was about to go out on the porch to see what was going on, but for some reason I felt the need to stop him. Something was making me feel really uneasy about all of this. I didn't know what was going on exactly, but something felt wrong to me. This was an area where people never locked their doors, whether it was during the day or even while they were sleeping, so he didn't seem to think anything was wrong. The very fact that truck was just sitting there, though, was really bugging me. I knew something was wrong. I went over to the door and locked it. He asked me what I thought was going on. I didn't know, and I told him that truthfully. I just got the feeling something was off here. We stood there for a while looking out the windows, wondering what was going to happen. Since Clay's parents were both gone, there weren't any vehicles in the driveway. It was obvious to anyone outside, though, that someone was in the home because of the lights inside. Still, the vehicle didn't do anything. It just continued to idle there. Out of nowhere, though, we heard a gunshot ring out in the night. It was definitely coming from the area around the truck. The two of us got scared, but we didn't drop to the floor like we probably should have. Instead, we ran to his parents' room and grabbed some of his dad's rifles. We heard another shot after that. Clay was feeling a lot of bravado and wanted to run outside with rifle in hand. I convinced him not to, though. As we continued hiding and discussing, we noticed something that we hadn't expected. The vehicle began shooting out of the driveway once again and drove off in a real hurry. Confused, we came out of the room. Nothing was broken, not a window or anything by a bullet. We couldn't figure out what they were shooting at or what just happened. Why had a guy put 2 shots out, which obviously did nothing, then just drove away? We checked outside and noticed something on the porch. Someone had dropped what looked to be animal trails all over the place. We didn't know what to make of this, but we knew for sure nothing like that had been there before. That guy must have put them there, but we had no idea why. We called Clay's dad, and he eventually came over to the house before his duty was over. He couldn't make any sense of this either. While he was there was a sudden phone call. It had to be about an hour after the vehicle had left. Apparently, the guy had said that next time he wouldn't miss. That was terrifying. It was just a really weird series of events. We guessed it had to be a threat against someone in particular. Clay's dad thought it was meant for him, since he was a park ranger and had arrested people for poaching and things like that, but we could never really be sure. During the big economics boom in Japan, there were many theme and amusement parks that opened up. Unfortunately, the fierce competition between them and the following economic recession caused many of them to close back down. Very few opened up again, and those that didn't remain open for very long. I suppose that was unfortunate for business and the theme park industry, but it's left some really interesting abandoned places in Japan. I mean, exploring an old empty house is one thing, but exploring an entire park when you're the only people there is something on a whole different level. Most major parks, despite what many might think, have been demolished by the time I went exploring, so most of the ones I had been to were smaller venues that no one might have heard of before. That might be another reason why they all closed down actually, because not many people used to go to them. There's definitely a pretty high creep factor in being in those places, and I have to admit, the places can play tricks on your mind that you wouldn't believe. You always constantly feel like you're being watched, always thinking you might see something that isn't really there. And that's what the worst part is. If you really do see something, how can you really be sure it actually happened? That was the huge appeal of going to these places, though. You get to freak yourself out pretty badly while remaining mostly safe. I've had my fair share of freakouts just like that. Those are all different stories though. This happened at the third abandoned theme park I decided to go and explore. It was a pretty old one. Honestly, I couldn't understand why it hadn't been torn down. I was taking a risk with the time I spent looking for it, honestly. I thought surely it must have been gone before I'd actually found it. At the entrance, I noticed something weird though. There was a board that had nails in it, with the point of the nail sticking upward. It was like the owners of the park wanted a cheap way to keep people out or something. It was easily detectable and I stepped right over it. As I kept on walking though, I tripped on what I later noticed was a tripwire and fell right on my face. I had to admit, that was pretty clever. The park itself didn't disappoint. I know it had some rides, but not a whole ton of them. There were tons of booths that had once probably sold food, merchandise, and had games to play. Everything was run down, rusted, crusty, overgrown, and wonderfully spooky. It didn't take long for the creep factor to really set in, and that feeling of being watched came over me pretty quickly. In fact, I began to get pretty paranoid. That was perfectly normal though. As I continued walking though, I was sure I'd just seen someone out of the corner of my eye hiding behind something. I turned swiftly to look and see if anyone was there, but when I didn't see anything at all. I didn't really give it too much thought. That's normally how these sorts of situations go. I was really enjoying the ambiance as I was walking around. Since I had seen someone nearby this merry-go-round type thing, I decided to go over and check it out. This thing was really run down. The riding animals were all decayed and filthy looking. I also noticed something really unusual though. A couple of them had barbed wire wrapped around them. It was pretty obvious if you looked closely, so no one would be stupid enough to actually get on the ride and hurt themselves. It just seemed really weird though that anyone would wrap them up like that. As I continued around, I noticed a lot of weird things like this. Barbed wire here and there, a place where there were more tripwires set up. This time I was ready for it and didn't trip. All this did make me start to wonder though. Had someone been here before? Why were there all these booby traps around? There was one roller coaster in the park that wasn't really that big. There was still a train on the tracks, and it was trapped too. It was more subtle razor wire wrapped on the drop-down harness. It was odd, and I couldn't quite figure it out. I thought I heard some footsteps quickly running behind me. When I turned around, I could have sworn I saw someone dash behind one of the booths. I felt my anxiety go up when I saw that, wondering if that really was my imagination just getting the better of me. I cautiously approached the area I thought I saw the person run behind. I was really nervous. I was expecting someone to pop up and attack me. As I walked around the back though, I couldn't see anyone there. I was getting really nervous. I wanted to be freaked out, but when the freaking out actually happens, it can feel a little weird. In the moment, you wonder what's going on. Then, I noticed something else. There was a cigarette on the ground, and it appeared to still be smoking a little. My heart jumped in my chest when I saw that, because that indicated I truly was not alone here. Then I heard a noise. It was a human scream, but not like a pained scream. It was something else altogether. The kind of scream you would make if you wanted to attack rather than being attacked. I turned toward the sound and saw another person. They were crouched behind the train of the roller coaster. He was standing right where I had been standing before. It kind of made me wonder if he had been there the entire time. He didn't attempt to run away or anything. He just crouched down behind the train so only his eyes were above and looking at me. The look he was giving me was not something I really wanted to see. It was quite scary. It was a look that told me I was not welcome here. I heard a noise off to the side of me. When I looked over, I saw another person. They were both male and both very young. They were both shirtless, with tattoos covering their torsos, and were wearing cargo shorts. What got me the most was the look in their eyes. I decided I had to leave. I was scared, though, that even if I moved, they might come after me. All they were doing, though, was looking at me. and my eyes met theirs each time. I had a feeling these were not the only two people here. I started walking toward the entrance after. I kept looking back over my shoulder to see if they were still there. However, they hid themselves again. I heard that horrible scream once more. It terrified me. Like an idiot, I started running and forgot about the tripwire at the entrance. I tripped on it, and as I was falling, I put my hands out to break my fall. As luck would have it, my left hand landed right on the board with those nails, puncturing the palm of my hand. Fortunately, I was able to pull it out rather quickly. I left that park and got as far away from it as I could. I don't know what was going on there. It makes sense people might try to live in these old places, but the things that were going on there were just way too weird. It felt like I was in danger the whole time. I never went back, and I don't tell this story to many people. I thought it might work well to share here, though. I was one of those teenagers that hated just about everything that came from being a teenager. I hated living at home with my parents. I hated having to go to school. I hated trying to live under anyone's rules. When I was 16, I didn't exactly drop out of high school. However, I did just quit going altogether. It wasn't interesting to me anymore. When my parents got contacted about it, they told me I had to go to school. We got into a huge fight, and they told me that if I didn't go to school, then I couldn't live there anymore. I knew it was a bluff, but I really didn't care. I was fed up with living there anyway, so I contacted a few of my best friends. They were people who also hated living at home. My friend Carl had a car, and we decided to take what we had, load up the car, and go live our lives away from our families. We started driving west. We figured we'd drive through some of the mountain states, then head to California. It seemed like the best place for a runaway from home to go. We had at least a little bit of money. It was enough to keep us up with gas and keep us fed for a while. I was the first one to run out, though I didn't really ration it nearly as well as I should have. When you spend a lot of time with people in the car, especially if you've never been with them for a long time before, it can get somewhat testy. As well, I think the fact I didn't have any money made everyone sort of pissed off at me. While we were driving through the mountains in Colorado, we stopped to take a bathroom break. When I was done and zipping up, I heard the car start up. As I tried to run back to the area, I saw them all pulling away without me. I yelled, demanding for them to come back. One of the guys flipped me the bird as they drove off and left me behind. Now I really had no idea what to do, so I just walked along the side of the road. We were way up high in the mountains, and the altitude was already making me sick. A few cars went by me, and I tried hitching from them, but I guess most people don't want to pick up a lonely guy on the roadside. I had been hitching for several hours, and it was very dark now. Of course, when it got dark, the temperature fell accordingly, and I began to fear for my life. Finally, after hours and hours passed by, a car stopped to pick me up. I eagerly jumped in the passenger seat. The man who picked me up seemed pretty normal at first. He was a bigger guy, really fit. He looked like he worked out quite a lot. He was driving a luxury car with seat warmers, so I figured he must be decently well off too. He seemed really interested in helping me. It was after we had some normal small talk that he began asking me some more about myself. You know, why I was outside hiking in the mountains. I told him my friends had abandoned me when I ran out of money. I also told him I was 18 years old. I think he knew I was lying, though. I barely even looked the 16 years I was. He got very interested in my story, why I had left with my friends to begin with. I was so thankful to have him pick me up, I just kept on answering all his questions without thinking. I didn't even harbor a thought he might have an ulterior motive. I slipped up and told him I'd left home because my parents and I weren't getting along. I don't think I was quite catching on that he was fishing for information. I just admitted I was a teenage runaway. Furthermore, a teenage runaway that no one knew where they were and might not possibly even care about. Then the conversation got much darker. The guy began telling me a story about the last time he'd picked up a hitchhiker. He made it seem like it was something he had done often. Told me it was another underage kid, making me realize he knew I was lying. I asked him what happened to the kid, and his response scared the crap out of me. Well, only I'll ever know. I tried to keep my fear hidden. I had so recently been grateful I'd been given a ride, but now I was terrified. I was trying to steer the talk back to this other hitchhiker, but he kept fishing around for more information about my home life. I was convinced I was going to end up a story this guy would tell another hitchhiker one day. I tried not to make it seem like I was afraid of him in any way. I asked him if we could stop at a rest area or something, because I badly had to go to the bathroom. He was unwilling to stop, so I began making my legs jump up a bit and pretended I needed to say. He told me we'd stop at a gas station in about 15 minutes. When he brought the car to a stop, I told him I'd be back soon and ran out into the store. I immediately let the cashier know what was going on. I pointed to the car out by the pump. The man saw me talking to the clerk, and at that point he immediately pulled away and took off down the road at blazing speeds. That in my mind just confirmed what I already believed. I was done with my adventure now. I asked the clerk if I could use the phone, and I called my parents who were worried about me. They wired me the money to get home. Turns out I was actually the lucky one. My friends, when they were out of money, held up a gas station and got in much more trouble than I did. Funny how that works out in the end. I used to work in one of those haunted corn mazes. Well, technically I didn't work in one of them. The people who worked in the corn mazes were the people dressed up as monsters and ghosts. I was just the ticket taker. In addition to taking the tickets, I was also the person who cleaned up after the maze was closed down. We stayed open until midnight, so by the time we got all the people out of the maze and cleaned up after them and closed up shop, it was usually around 1 a.m. in the morning. On this particular night the story took place. It was a night just before Halloween. We were very busy because of this. The other ticket taker had also called in sick, making me the only person who was there to do the job. I can't say I was too happy about that exactly. Although the time did go by really quickly. I barely had a chance to breathe. Before I knew it, the day was over though. The people and all the actors had cleared out. I waved to all my colleagues as they went home, and before I knew it, the once completely packed area was now empty, all except for me walking over to the maze. I realized the actors hadn't really cleaned up the maze at all. I noticed there were several food wrappers on the ground. I didn't want to leave the work for the next day, so I grabbed up a broom and one of those standing dustpans and went to clean up a bit. I have to admit to feeling a bit of a buzz as I walked through the maze. Although I had been in it by myself before, this was the first time I had done it in the middle of the night. It was eerily quiet, save for the sounds of bugs and stuff. I had a map of the maze with me, so I wouldn't get lost. I had to use the flashlight on my cell phone in order to be able to see at all. I'm not sure how long I'd been in the maze before I began to feel like I was being watched. Blap, it was a haunted corn maze. I was able to brush it off because being scared was exactly how I was supposed to feel in this scenario. The feeling didn't really go away though. It wasn't too long before I began to hear these little noises. At first, it was just simple things, like corn stalks rustling. That could have been chalked up to the wind. I also began to think I was hearing footsteps though. Very cliché. They would stop whenever I stopped walking. I chalked that one up to my imagination or an echo of something. What I couldn't brush off was the sound of a can crushing as someone accidentally stepped on it. I immediately called out to check if anyone was there and got no answer back. A few minutes later, I heard a similar noise of trash being crushed underfoot. I called out again. There was nothing but general anxiety now. It was beginning to develop into paranoia. I was sure there was someone in the maze with me. I immediately thought it must be one of the actors. It was technically Halloween now, Maybe he'd remained in the maze and didn't clean it up on purpose, drawing me into it in an attempt to scare me and prank me. I called out and told whoever it was that I would not be getting scared. I was lying just a little bit though. I was already very scared. The more intermittent noises I continued to hear, the more I called out with no answer. I began to get even more paranoid about what was going on. The joke had gone on far enough. Finally, I'd had more than enough of this. I wasn't completely finished cleaning the maze, but I decided the rest of it would have to wait till tomorrow. If it did happen to be one of the actors following me around in the maze, then I'd make them clean up in the morning. How's that for a prank? I made my way back to the entrance of the maze. I stopped hearing those noises as I went along to the exit. I went out, went and closed the ticket booth. When I was about done, I tried to quickly look back at the maze. I jumped in surprise when I saw a figure standing in the entranceway. I didn't know who it was, and by looking at the size of this person, there was no way it was any of the actors I knew. This man was much taller than any of the ones we had working. I realized he had been following me around the maze the whole time. He didn't make any moves toward me, but I didn't give him much of a chance to anyway. I had the lockbox with the ticket money in it. I figured that must have been what he was after. A weird thought struck me though. If he was after the money, why had he been following me around in the maze when I'd like an idiot left the box laying right on the ticket booth in the open? The only explanation was that he was after me. I grabbed the box and sprinted over to my car. I looked back once over my shoulder, only to see the man was now right next to the ticket booth. Unfortunately, this wasn't exactly a horror movie. The car started immediately. I pulled out and left. The following morning, I arrived to the corn maze, and I asked if anyone had been there past closing, or if they knew anyone who had. No one did. The man who was following me around that corn maze was clearly not supposed to be there. I live in a pretty affluent neighborhood due to getting a decent inheritance from my parents. I got their house and some money, which would have been more than enough for me to live on for quite a while. Even though I didn't make a lot of money working as an adjunct professor at a nearby community college, I really enjoyed the work. Because of this, even though I technically didn't need to work right now, I still continued to do so. I mention this because I was a bit out of place in this neighborhood. I was unmarried and I didn't have any kids either. Along with that, I worked a job where I sometimes had to deal with some unruly and immature children. All these things together made it so that if someone were to try and do something to me, it really could have been any number of people. I had gotten home from work around dusk one day. It was my favorite day of the week because I didn't have any night classes to teach. The sun was almost all the way down when I arrived home, but not quite there yet. It was going to be trash day the following morning, so I went into the garage to get the cans ready to take out to the street. When I brought the cans outside, though, I noticed someone walking on the other side. I didn't really know my neighbors too well, so I didn't know who this was exactly. While I was taking out the garbage, I began to have this really weird feeling. I'm sure every single one of you reading this has had it before. You feel like someone is looking at you, even though you have no reason to really think they are. The feeling was so intense though, I just had to look up and see what was going on. The guy who I'd seen walking across the street was walking very slowly now, and he seemed to be staring over in my direction. As soon as he caught me looking at him though, he looked away right away. Afterward, he began walking faster down the street. I didn't really think that much about it. That sort of thing happens all the time. I finished placing the garbage and recycling cans in their proper places and went back into my home. After that, I remember fixing myself a drink. If you've ever been a community college teacher, you know exactly why. Sometimes when you're grading some papers, the only thing that keeps you from fearing for the future of humanity is having a solid drink. Oh, by the way, I taught English 1 and 102 specifically, so that gives you a bit of an idea of what I had to deal with. After about an hour of grading these papers, I decided to go prepare something for dinner. As I was coming back to my seat in the front room though, I just happened to look out the front window. There was a street lamp right across the street from my house. I noticed a figure standing in the shadows just to the side of the direct light. I had to squint a bit to even see if someone was actually there though. When I did, I could have sworn I saw them moving further away from the light. I thought about that guy I'd seen earlier that had been looking at me. Now I was mildly concerned. I didn't really think though that someone was out there targeting me or even aware of my presence in any way. Instead, I thought maybe someone was out there planning to break into one of my neighbors' houses or something. It was merely a passing thought though. Sometimes I knew I could let my imagination get away from me. I tried not to concern myself too much. I had some dinner and continued grading papers. I didn't see anything else strange the few times I'd gotten up and checked again. I did keep looking out the window though, just in case this figure actually was someone shady. There was one time I thought I might have seen someone skulking about, but I couldn't be completely sure. By the time I ended up going to bed that night, I had all but forgotten about seeing that figure outside. Later on though, I woke up in the middle of the night, breathless and completely unaware of what was going on. All I knew was that I woke up in shock in bed and couldn't breathe for some reason. After my head started to quickly clear up, I realized someone was in my room and they had their hands over my nose and mouth and were trying to smother me. I bucked and struggled, but you have to know how hard it is when you can't breathe. I went into full-on panic mode. Something occurred to me in that moment. If this person was trying to kill me, maybe I should just act like I was dead. So I went limp, rolled my eyes, and held my chest still, holding my breath and not struggling anymore. I pretended to be dead. This person still held their hand over my face for a few more seconds, but after they removed them, I did my best not to breathe and to make them think I was truly dead. The person stood up for a moment and looked over at me. Then he turned and walked out the door, not even bothering to check my pulse. I was shocked, but I began to take short little breaths until I was sure he was far enough away. Then I really pulled in the freaking air. I was scared, but I got up. I was hurting from the smothering, but I was determined to get this guy. Unfortunately, he left the house and got away before I could catch up to him. Instead of trying to follow him, I called 911. I can't really think of why anyone would try to kill me. To this day, I have no idea who he was or why he tried to do it at all. Fortunately, I never had any other attempts on my life, but that also keeps me from having any idea why this could have possibly happened. Back when I was in college down in Florida, I used to work a part-time job at this pretty upscale motel. The motel had this really nice pool, and this one time, after a series of pretty gnarly rainstorms, I was tasked with cleaning it up. It was really nothing out of the ordinary. We actually had a specialist that came in when the pool was that bad, but my manager said the guy was up to his eyeballs on other jobs and wouldn't be able to come down for a few days at least. Since this was really costing us guests, he told me that if I got it done myself, he'd let me go early and still pay me the full day's wage. Absolutely a no-brainer, so I accepted right away. About a half hour into the job or so, this absolutely perfect 10 out of 10 knockout of a girl around my age came out to the pool in her bikini and asked how long it would be until the pool was fully swimmable. I shrugged and told her I didn't really know. It was taking a long time as it was, and I'd only scooped a quarter of the debris out of it. Then, to my luck though, she seemed content to just chill by the pool in one of those sun loungers until I finished everything up. I got where she was coming from. It was really hot outside. After a while, she started making a little small talk with me. After about a half hour of back and forth, I'd managed to pretty much clear the entire shallow end of all the plant trash. She asked if she could dip her legs into the shallows. I thought, sure, why not? As she did so, though, I noticed a bunch of small, dark things swimming out of one of the filters towards her legs. Apparently, she hadn't seen them because she was too busy turned towards me. I just straight up screamed, "Get your legs out of the pool!" She looked at me like I was crazy, as I just okayed her putting them down. When she looked down, though, she let out this ear-splitting scream, then basically sprinted back to her room in tears. If you've never seen Florida water bugs, now is the time to Google them. More specifically, Google just how big they can get. Somehow, I'd never seen these evil-looking things until right then. And man, they're a sight not likely to be forgotten anytime soon. Worst thing is, they actually do bite people too, which is exactly how they got their nickname of toe biters. They're not exactly dangerous in the sense that they're poisonous or anything, but they're just about the last thing you want to see while you're swimming, and you definitely don't want to get that many bites on you either. I'm not great with bugs, so I got the hell out of there, and told my boss that as much as I appreciated the offer of the day off, I would not be carrying on with cleaning the pool that day. His response was literally, come on, they won't kill you if they bite you." I straight up told him I'd rather he fire me than make me clean all that up with those terrifying things swimming and flying around. Thankfully, he relented and told me to close the pool off by putting some chairs around it like a little fort, until the real pool guy could come out and completely drain and filter the thing. Apparently, they're pretty easy to kill just by using vinegar or something, but the pool guy still uses protective gloves and stuff, because get this, water bugs can even fake being dead, then pop back up alive and bite you after tricking you into thinking you're safe. That's just pure nightmare fuel to me. Florida was fun, and I'm glad I got to experience living there while I was in college, but I sure don't miss all the tropical wildlife down there. And seriously, if I never have to look at another giant water bug for the rest of my freaking life, it will be way too soon. My SO and I had a big fight, and I decided to leave the party we were at. It was only about 9 p.m., and I was crying, so I wanted to go home, rather than go with everyone else to the bar crawl. I hailed a cab, got in, and gave him the address. The directions only needed 3 turns to get home. I then started text arguing on my phone, still crying. I was too engrossed in the argument, though, and realized too late that he had taken a left 2 streets earlier than he was supposed to. My phone was kind of messed up, so even though it said it still had battery, it just suddenly went black and wouldn't turn on anymore. I looked up and noticed we were not on the right track. "Hey, wait, where are we?" At that point, the guy started speeding like crazy, going towards the highway. I started screaming, but he was not even reacting to me. Before he turned onto the highway, he had to slow down by a light though. I frantically tried to open my door to bail, only to realize it was child-locked. He ended up going 90 miles per hour down a 2-lane road, then turning into a dark alley behind a small empty office building. He reached back and grabbed me and tried to pull me towards him. This part is a little bit blurry. I remember frantically twisting my body, so much so that he lost his grip and my head was by the passenger side window. I knocked open the door with my head and tumbled out into the gravel and glass. I got up and started running. Only problem was, I was in the middle of nowhere. There were no street lights, no cars to flag down for help. I made a swift judgment call and ran towards the office building. I found a hiding place inside, and I could hear him walking around and yelling, "Hey, I'm sorry, I won't try anything. Just come back to the car and I'll drive you home for real, free of charge. There's nothing out here, I promise. You'll be out here all night, just get back in the car." He went back to his car and slowly drove around in a circle, clearly searching for me. When I saw his car pull out and start off down the street again, I waited for a couple more minutes, then ran as fast as I could until I came upon a tiny hole-in-the-wall biker saloon. Obviously, I was bawling my eyes out, saying I needed to go inside and use their phone to call the cops. The bouncer wouldn't let me in because I didn't have my ID. I'd left my purse in the cab, unfortunately. I pled with them, but I guess they didn't believe my story. 2 guys parked out front started creepily catcalling me. I freaked and started running again, trying to find someone who would help me. I ended up stumbling upon a closed Walgreens at an intersection. That's when I realized my dead phone was still in my pocket. I tried to turn it back on, and after multiple tries, it finally worked. I called 911 and gave them my location. They said they were on the way, and then the phone went black and dead once again. I waited for about 45 minutes, but no one arrived. Panicking, I tried again. I had to finagle my phone for a long time, but eventually it worked, and I called my SO. No answer. I called his roommate who picked up, and as quickly as I could while choking on tears, told him where I was, and he needed to come get me immediately. He did so, thank God. I got in the car and we called 911 together. The police said they would meet us at his apartment. After 2 hours, we called again. They said they would be there in half an hour, but they never came. I went to the station the next morning to report it. That's not where the story ends, though. A couple days later, I get a call from my apartment complex saying, "Hey, we have your purse at the office. Come by and get it." I almost fainted. How? I talked to the office staff, who said the people at my old apartment had turned it in for me. We'd recently moved away from that 1-bedroom to a new 2-bedroom. I went to my old apartment and knocked on the door. The couple living there said a guy matching the cab driver's description had started banging on their door and yelling late last night. It's not the best area of town, so the husband opened the door with his gun drawn and asked the man what the hell he was doing. He stuttered something about returning my purse. The husband had a bad vibe though, and made him fork it up with his gun and leave. He drove away in his cab after. The wife wrote down the cab info that she could see from under the street lamp. I can't imagine what would have happened if he still lived there. I'm so glad the couple was well protected. I work as a nanny, and after telling my employer about this, she was horrified. She told me I needed to look at something. She's a lawyer, and her firm had been working on compiling a case against that same cab company for hiring multiple people with violent criminal records. A couple of weeks later, with her help and the information from that couple, my attacker was caught. To this day, there's so many what-ifs that terrify me. What if I didn't get away? What if he had just turned around and come back down the street? What if I'd actually changed the address on my license when I properly should have? I'm very thankful everything lined up for me to get away. I'm not exactly sure if this story is YouTube friendly at the moment, but it is the scariest night of my life. I kid you not, this story is 100% true. I know it sounds like a horror movie, but this very well could have been something that actually was in a scary movie. Only, it could happen to anyone. My boyfriend and I are into making love secretly in public places. We have a list of places where we do it. We call it our bucket list. Anyway, one location was a cornfield. Around Halloween time, we were sitting on the couch bored, taking shots of vodka and not exactly looking forward to having kids ringing on the doorbell all night long. Halloween night was obviously a good night to get out, so we decided to visit a corn maze. We dressed in warm clothes and got on our way. We both knew how the night would end, making love in a cornfield. One more to cross off the list. We go through the maze with the different jump scares, we scream and giggle. We were having a blast together. After a while, we didn't get any more jump scares. It was very dark, and for some stupid reason, we hadn't brought our phones with us. Looking back, I think we didn't bring them so we could immerse ourselves in the Halloween spirit more. Because of this though, we had no clue what time it was, and it turns out the maze was now closed. He and I were admittedly very tipsy. We ended up going off the stupid path. out into the corn stalks, we found this wooden fence. A wooden fence which happened to be the perfect spot for my boyfriend of 3 years to bend me over. We began caressing each other's faces, putting our lips together. He pushes my skirt up and begins pulling my tights down when I hear a snap. I have severe anxiety, and I know that doesn't fit with someone who's down to do this sort of thing in public, but it's just part of who I am. I moved my hand and placed it on my boyfriend's chest, signaling for him to stop. I turned my head in the direction of where I'd heard that single snap. "Hey, did you hear that?" I whispered to my boyfriend. He replied, "No, I'm just focused on you." You know, usual boyfriend response. We were about to start up again, but I was feeling really nervous. Something didn't feel right here. I heard another snapping sound. I turned around immediately. "Okay, you can't tell me you didn't just hear that," I whispered to my boyfriend. He looked curious and concerned. "I heard it that time too." We stayed quiet, but we didn't hear anything else for 5 more minutes. We deduced it had to be a raccoon or something, and we're starting to get back to business. Now though, I started to hear some heavy breathing. "Did I wear you out already?" I jokingly expressed. "Not at all," my boyfriend replied, and that's when I realized he wasn't even out of breath. We must have been too into our activities that we didn't notice what was standing in front of us. As I looked up, I could see there was a man. He was at least 6 foot tall, dressed in a Scream costume, but instead of a knife, he held a machete. Scream was the first horror movie I ever saw, and always remained my #1 favorite movie, but not after this. I'm 5'3" and my boyfriend is 5'6", so this guy was completely towering over us. I screamed out my boyfriend's name. He stopped and looked up and yelled to follow him. I'm directionally challenged, so if I ran by myself, I would get lost for days. On the other hand, my boyfriend somehow knows where he's going at all times, so I followed him closely. His Adidas and my snow boots trekked through that corn maze. I could hear heavy footsteps following behind us. They didn't sound like they were too close though. We rushed until we reached the gate of the corn maze. It was obviously closed since the park was closed as well. We looked back, only to see the man no longer in sight. My boyfriend helped me over the fence and climbed over himself after. We could see our car was the only car in the lot. I turned around, only to see the man now hacking away at the gate with his machete. He was actually starting to break the links. I yelled out in absolute terror. My boyfriend picked me up and started running to the car with me in his arms. He yelled at me to get in the car. We both jumped in, and he pulled out in his red Subaru. The last thing I saw was the machete-wielding ghost face bending his body through a hole in the chain-link fence he'd managed to chop away. He stood there, watching us drive away into the moonlight, waving his machete angrily in the air, as if to say we were lucky we got away. Next Halloween, I think we'll just stay home with our cats and hand out candy. I'm also never going to watch Scream ever again. My grandmother had a lot of kids, and I was the son of her oldest daughter. She actually had a couple of sons who were only a few years older than I was. Even though we lived in a different state, whenever we visited the grandparents, it was more like I had my brothers with me, rather than them being my uncles. I always wanted to do everything with them, and as the adults really didn't want to bother with us too much, they didn't really have a problem with that. There were some things that my uncles Jeb and Carl did that I didn't really like. I mean, they chewed tobacco or snuff ever since I could remember. I think I tried it once and ended up throwing up right away. To this day, I still don't really understand why people enjoy doing that. When I was 14 years old and visiting them, they had some beer on them. For the record, they were 17 and 15 at the time. It wasn't something I turned down. I didn't really like the taste of it right away. However, I did want to get drunk with my uncle, so I was able to easily overlook that. My grandpa knew that they drank beer and he didn't really care. However, if my mom had ever found out that I was drinking, especially at 14 years old, there would have been a lot of hell to pay for quite a few people. Because of this, we decided to do it out of the house, and that meant jumping into Jeb's pickup truck and driving out through the hills. This was in the 1970s, which doesn't exactly excuse driving drunk, but in areas like this, young guys drinking beers and driving around their trucks in the country was not an unusual thing at all. The first time I tried that was at 14, and it happened during the fall. I hadn't actually expected the chance to go drinking, but I was really excited when they mentioned it. Jeb and Carl told my parents they were going to take me over to a friend's house and be back later. No one really even thought about it, and it wasn't really a lie either, because they were going to go and pick up another guy friend of theirs too. By the time that my uncles picked up their friend Robbie, his little brother, who was around my age, decided to tag along as well. That was fine because the little brother and I could ride in the bed of the truck. They had one of those windows on the back of the cab that slid open, so we could chat if we really needed to, and we could hand them beer since the cooler was in the back with us. This was in an Appalachian area, so there were a lot of hills and country to drive through. It was really crisp and cool outside, and the leaves were also falling pretty hard. It was already dark outside as we were driving around, but we didn't spend the entire time driving around the roads. Occasionally, we would stop somewhere random, pull off to the side, pull up to the side of a hill and look over to the other side, playing music, just drinking and talking. I always remember this night for many reasons. I mean, it's obvious that most people remember the first time they ever get drunk, and I was experiencing that this very night, but I remember it for a completely different reason too. I had been out on rides with my uncles before on non-drinking days, so I knew what to expect. It was driving on twisting, dark, graveled roads that were only wide enough for one vehicle to drive down. You had to be careful in the back of the truck, because occasionally a small branch from a tree might stretch over and slap you in the face. It didn't really matter much that the roads were so thin though, because you very rarely, if ever, came across another vehicle on those roads. At one point, we found a nice area to pull over in. It was like a little bit of a grassy area off to the side that looked like the perfect place to stop. We pulled over there and my uncle shut the truck off. For a while, the five of us just sat there drinking, hanging out, and having a really good time. Even though it was my first time drinking, I was really going slow as to not get sloshed out of my mind, so I was able to somewhat keep my wits about me. We were sitting there in the dark when Robbie began mentioning seeing some weird lights off in the woods. His brother and I didn't really notice them at first, or even really try to look, but eventually he made us look out there and keep looking. And we too came to see these moving lights out in the woods. My uncles and Robbie all wanted to go out and check what these were. Me and the brother, however, didn't want to. We let them go by themselves while we remained in the truck drinking and talking. We didn't think too much about them going off and checking out those lights. At most, it would be some hunters out late at night or something like that. It wasn't too much to be worried about. I don't know how long it was, but after a while, the three of them came running frantically back to the truck. The brother and I didn't really think anything was wrong at first, until they started climbing in. Looking inside, we noticed that one of them was injured, bleeding profusely and holding something up against the wound. What the hell happened? There were these two really freaky-looking guys out there, Carl began telling us. They looked like they were out hunting or something, so we were wondering what they were doing, but when we got closer, one of them took out a knife and just stabbed Robbie out of nowhere. I can't say I really believed them at first. I almost thought my uncles were playing some sort of prank on us. It was the sort of thing they would have done. The pure fact they didn't start the truck right away and let Carl explain what was going on made me believe that even more. I thought if they really were as scared as they were saying they were, the very first thing we should do is get out of there right away. I do remember them starting the truck up pretty fast though and trying to turn around so we could head back down the direction we had come from. It took a few moments to get ourselves turned around before pulling out. Still thinking it may have been some sort of prank, I looked back toward the trees. Although all I had to see with were the red lights on the back of the truck, I was able to make out something that sticks in my memory to this day. Two of the strangest looking men I've ever seen came skulking out of the woods, making their way towards us. It was really weird. They weren't moving very fast. In fact, they were moving almost like they had some sort of problems walking or something like that. They looked just like something out of The Hills Have Eyes or Mad Max. It was utterly terrifying to see in the dark. I yelled at them to get the hell out of there as quickly as they could. There wasn't a whole lot of space between them and the tailgate of the truck before we got turned around and began to drive. They were honestly close enough. I thought they were just going to grab on and jump into the bed. Robbie's brother and I were terrified and screaming, telling them to get the fuck out of there. We got out of there right there and then, and it was a terrifying ride from then on. It was completely dark and we were drunk and scared. We didn't know what was going on. The two of us definitely didn't want to be in the bed of the truck for the ride back, but there wasn't anything we could do about that now. We just had to put up with being exposed for the ride back. Rather than go to a hospital or anything, they drove right to Robbie's house. They didn't want to drive into town drunk and figured it would be best if Robbie's parents drove him out themselves. Once it was just my uncles and I again, we didn't drive back right away. They decided they needed to have a few beers again to calm down. Of course, at that point, I jumped back in the cab with them. There was no way I was going to stay in the bed. It was hard to calm down after what happened. My uncles insisted there were some weird sad people out in the hills, but they seemed like something out of a horror movie. Robbie turned out okay in the end, except for having an ugly scar that was as bad as the emotional ones we got that night. When I was about 14 years old, my parents began letting me stay home by myself. At first, it was only times when they would go out to eat or something of that sort. It was nice to have a few hours in the house by myself, but when I proved to them that I was able to stay home alone without any problems, this amount of time definitely increased over time. When I was 15 years old, I actually got to stay home by myself over a 4-day weekend. My parents wanted to go on a holiday cruise. They hadn't planned on going without me. I just had no interest in going at all. I wouldn't tell them this for years afterward, but being on a big ship like that in the middle of the ocean was pretty scary to me. Plus, it would be nice to have the house all to myself for a whole 4 days. Up to that point, 2 days had been the longest I'd ever been allowed to be by myself. I had the best plans for the time I was going to be home, too. I was going to eat myself a ton of pizza, play a ton of video games. Actually, I think that was about it. It sure was going to be the perfect weekend, though. They left on Friday morning. I did have school on that day, and I got out of school at the normal time. Normally, my mom would pick me up and drive me home, but I was going to be walking home that day. There weren't many kids from the school who walked, so it was pretty much me, myself, and I on the way home. It was about a 30-minute walk or so through town, then through part of my neighborhood to get home. My mom was a homemaker, so this was one of the few times when I got home that I found the house completely empty. It was a really weird experience, and I have to admit it did feel a little strange at first. My dad was a doctor, so we lived in a pretty nice and big house. Being alone in such a place is always quite the experience. That night, I put my plan into motion. I ordered some pizza, grabbed myself some soda, and didn't tell my parents at all, but I nicked some drinks out of the liquor cabinet too. I settled in and played some video games until I fell asleep in my room. I didn't bother to turn on any of the lights in the house either. Whenever I had to walk around to get something or otherwise, I just walked around in the dark. I could still see where I was going because of outside lights shining in through the downstairs windows. Plus, I was playing all these horror games, and those are best to play when you keep the house nice and dark. I was wearing my headphones as I was playing too. If you play horror games, you know they're a lot more fun with the headphones in. You can hear the sounds that might be warning you of upcoming terror approaching you from behind or around a corner perhaps. It makes the situation a whole lot scarier, but that's why we enjoy it. I kept my headset on as I was walking throughout the house too, since these were wireless headphones. A few times I went and grabbed myself another drink. I didn't worry about my parents finding out about that though. They drank enough that I highly doubted they would pay attention to a tiny amount missing from their liquor cabinet. I wasn't used to drinking though, so I just kept taking these tiny little sips each time I came out. I got up and went to get myself another drink, but as I was walking back toward the steps, I had the strangest feeling wash over me. I don't know how to describe it really, just like a feeling of knowing you're not alone. I hadn't gotten such a feeling before, and I really didn't care for it. Going up the stairs, I was pretty nervous. I didn't really know why though. It was just a feeling and I didn't see anything. I tried to brush it off as nothing. It must have come out of nowhere. When I got to the top though, I don't know why I did this, but I turned to look down the stairs. When I did, I found myself staring at a large man standing right there. Someone had broken into the house. Maybe they thought it was deserted because I had all the lights off at the time. When the guy saw me looking down at him though, that's when things really got scary. The man immediately started to bolt up the stairs after me. I ran as fast as I could, trying to get into my bedroom. I was able to get there just before him and get the door closed. As I locked it shut, I immediately heard pounding and slamming on the door. I ran to my cell phone. This flimsy door was not going to hold for very long. In fact, if this guy had any sense, he'd just unlock it from the outside. It didn't matter though. I called 911. The response was pretty swift. There must have been a police car close by or something, because I heard sirens pretty much instantly. I guess the guy heard them too, because he stopped pounding on the door. I heard him running away back down the stairs. I didn't know what to do, so I went to look out the window. My window faced the backyard, and that's the way the intruder chose to get out. I watched as he jumped over the fence. Unfortunately for him though, the cops caught up to him pretty much right away and tackled him down to arrest him. They brought him by the house so I could identify him as the same man I'd seen. Even though it had been completely dark, I knew that this was him. The guy ended up going to jail after a long process, and I was pretty happy about that. What I wasn't happy about were the memories of what happened though. I mean, I was walking around the house with my headphones on, and the man was in there the entire time while I was doing this apparently. I wonder how much was going on in that house that I hadn't noticed in those moments. I wonder why he'd just been in there with me totally unaware, just hanging out the entire time. I wonder how long I really had been in danger. I first got on the internet in the late 1990s. I was pretty naive at the time, as I assume many of us were. I was so overwhelmed by the amount of people I met and the supposed friends that I made. I was 16 years old, and I was really at odds with my parents at the time. And that was when I began talking to a girl who lived in California, though we never had any sort of romantic talking. We became what I believed were really good friends. I told her a lot about what was going on in my life, and a couple of weeks after we'd begun talking, she told me that if I ever needed a place to live, I could come and stay with her. Well, I took her completely seriously, so I decided to just up and leave in the middle of the night one night and take the Greyhound all the way to California. I didn't have much money, but there was enough to get me to where I was going. After the nearly 4-day trip across the country, when I got to the station, she was nowhere to be seen. I tried calling her and there was no answer either. I thought maybe she was just on her way to pick me up, but I waited and I called and I waited and called again. I soon came to the realization she was never going to come and get me. Because I believed someone that I didn't know, I ended up in a city that I knew nothing about, with no money, family, or friends. I wasn't sure what to do. It's not like I could just call my parents. I know a lot of you probably think that I could, but they would have told me that I made the mess and I would have to find my own way out of it. I spent as much time as I could in the bus station, but my time soon ran out when I was asked by a security guard to show my bus ticket. Of course, I didn't have one, so I was forced to leave soon after. I had to wander around LA on my own. I think most people would be surprised at the things you would do when you have no money and no way to get food or shelter. Your qualms about taking food out of the garbage go away very quickly, as do your cares about breaking into abandoned buildings in order to find a place to sleep. Yeah, I was naive and somewhat stupid for going to California in the first place, but I also found myself to be extremely trusting of other people that I didn't know. After about a week of sleeping on the streets trying to find some sort of runaway shelter and failing, I was sleeping in an alleyway. Something suddenly woke me up. It moved my leg a little bit. I was briefly aware of the sensation, but then I felt it again. This was definitely someone kicking me lightly on the side of the leg. When I woke up, there was a rather large man standing right next to me. Startled, I jumped up and was about to run away when the man stopped me and told me he was not a cop, and he wasn't going to hurt me or anything either. He told me that he'd noticed me sleeping in the alley and wondered if he could get me a bite to eat, or perhaps give me a place to sleep for just one night. Well, as you can imagine, I was eager for both, so I agreed. He took me to a fast food restaurant and let me order a ton of food. I scarfed it all down while he talked to me about my situation. I don't know how much of it I was actually paying attention to. It just felt so good to be getting some hot food in me. He then loaded me up in his car and told me he'd find me a safe place to sleep for the night. I honestly thought this meant he would be taking me to a motel or something. He didn't, though. He took me to a house outside the city. It looked like it was abandoned or something. The lawn was obviously uncared for, and the place was not kept up at all either. I recall the windows being boarded up as well. Still, I didn't think too much about it. I'd slept in many different abandoned buildings over the past week, so having another one was no big deal. The man opened the door, which was not unlocked, and he let me walk first into the building. It was dark, and he made no moves to turn on the light. He walked over to a door and told me I could sleep in that room. I didn't know how to respond, really. I looked into the doorway and saw it wasn't a room at all. In fact, it was a staircase leading downward into the darkness. For the very first time, I paused. When I did so, the jerk grabbed me from behind and shoved me down the stairs. I fell hard all the way down to the bottom. As I did, I heard him close and lock the door behind me. A few moments later, I heard his car start up and he drove away. This was certainly an odd situation. I was homeless, and even though I was locked in a room, at least I was not outside in the cold. I'd also been put in this place against my will, though. I explored the room. There was nothing in there. No food, no water, no bed, no blanket. It was just a completely empty basement, with a single window that was too high up on the wall for me to reach it. I decided to sleep and just wait it out and see what the guy was planning. He didn't come back right away, though. In fact, I fell asleep and was woken up in the morning by the sun shining down through that window. He didn't come back that day. He didn't come back that night either. He didn't come back the following day or the following night. At this point, I was beginning to get really scared. Yeah, I was hungry, but the thing I was most worried about was water. I knew I couldn't survive much longer without it. I was going to die of dehydration, which is an agonizing way to die. Another day passed, and I felt myself getting weaker, like I would die at any moment. I had gone almost 3 full days without any water. I had been told before that 3 full days was the maximum amount before you couldn't live any longer. I didn't die yet, but I felt so sick and wonky that I couldn't even get up. I was falling in and out of sleep for who knows how long. I was jolted awake after who knows when, once I saw light shining down through the window. Fear gripped me, because I assumed it was that man coming back for me. He'd probably assumed I'd long since died and was coming to take my body away, or whatever it was he did with people he did this to. I tried to get up to my feet. Maybe I could try to trip him or something as he came through the door. However, I couldn't even bring myself to my knees, much less onto my feet. I just lay there weakly, listening as the door was unlocked. I heard footsteps on the upper floor. I had all these thoughts running through my head. Once he noticed I wasn't dead, he would probably just kill me himself. I wanted to be ready for something, but I didn't know what I could do. I'm not sure how long I heard walking around with the door opened. When a light shined down on me, I heard a woman's voice saying something, but I couldn't tell what it was. I passed out again and woke up next time in the hospital. My throat was extremely dry, and there was an IV in my arm. It turned out that the old house was for sale, and it was being showed. The agent was the one who opened the door and called the police and an ambulance when they saw me down there. I told the cops about the man, but there was no indication who he was. He was not the owner of the house, and as far as they knew, he never came back either. The police told me they figured he was just some sicko who wanted people to find dead bodies in their basement. I wasn't the first person they'd found in such a predicament. I was lucky that I managed to survive as long as I did. It was mostly because I was a minor. My parents were contacted, and they put me on a plane and brought me home. Interestingly enough, our problems we had seemed very minor once I got back home. My neighborhood had one of those corn mazes every fall. Honestly, I don't quite understand them myself. It was supposed to be a Halloween attraction, but I couldn't really ever figure out what they had to do with Halloween. It's not like it was a haunted corn maze or something. I've seen those before, but this one was not like that. It was simply a regular corn maze that you were supposed to find your way through. The maze did change every year, so it was a new challenge to go through. Although I didn't understand the point of these things, that didn't mean I begrudged others who did enjoy them, and it didn't mean I didn't enjoy them either. In fact, I loved those corn mazes. This was in spite of what happened to me the very first time I went through one, though. I was 8 years old at the time this happened. My parents didn't work a traditional workday schedule. This made things pretty easy on us when it came to going places. What I mean is that there were much more times they weren't busy that we were able to go on trips because of this. For example, if you wanted to see a movie at noon on a weekday, you could enjoy a nearly empty theater. The corn maze opened on a Wednesday. I thought this was odd somewhat. My mom took us to it that afternoon, and it was completely empty as we expected. The attendant told my mom that if we really wanted to, we could go through the maze one by one. This would make it more challenging and atmospheric. I begged my mom to let me go through it first, and I did so. Even though it was in the middle of the day, I was still quite scared. It was very creepy sneaking through the maze like that all by myself. There were many dead ends, and I hit most of them. My 8-year-old mind could get very paranoid about hitting so many dead ends. Even though I didn't give it much mind, over time my brain did start worrying about me not being able to find my way out of the maze. That's when I heard a voice. I wasn't sure exactly where it was coming from, nor what it actually said at first. It was clearly a human voice, though. I began wondering if I had taken so long in the maze that they had sent someone in to find me. Maybe it was my brother and he'd come looking for me or something. I tried to follow the voice when I heard it again. I actually followed it right into another dead end. I was about to turn around and try to find a different pathway when I finally heard the voice clearly. They were singing some song about corn. I was a little freaked out for some reason. It just seemed like a weird thing for someone to just be singing randomly in the maze. It was also scary because I couldn't tell where the voice was coming from. I wondered if it was from the other side of the corn wall or something. I asked if anyone was there. There was a long pause, and then I heard them singing again. I asked where the person talking was talking from. The only answer I received was more singing. While staring at that corn wall in front of me though, I watched an arm come out of it. Seeing the arm emerging, I suddenly felt my eyes focus. I was now able to see there was a person crouched down in the corn hiding. He beckoned at me. Come on. I didn't know who this was, so I turned and started running. I didn't know if he was chasing after me. All I could hear were my own footsteps and my heart beating in my ears. I finally ran into my brother. He was wondering why I was so freaked out. I explained what just happened. He took me back toward the entrance of the maze, and we told the attendant that someone was hiding out there in the corn. He had also been trying to get me to walk into it with him. He went into the corn maze and checked himself, and claimed he didn't find anyone there. Still though, he was nice enough to give my parents their money back, and also insisted we were the very first customers that had shown up that day, so we had no idea how anyone had gotten in or out of the maze without him seeing them. To this day, I can still see that person in my mind, crouching in the corn and beckoning me to come towards them. Back when I was still getting some money together for college, one of the 2 jobs I worked was a housekeeping job for a certain motel chain. It was on that job that I saw some of the weirdest, creepiest things I've ever put eyes on, and to this day, some of them remain unexplained. I'm not suggesting that this one was supernatural though. I'm sure there's a perfectly logical and reasonable explanation for it, especially in a county with such bad garbage problems as this one, but it definitely left me and my coworkers on edge for at least a few hours after. So there we are, going from room to room, knocking on doors, calling out housekeeping, that whole ordeal. Me and my coworkers were sort of leapfrogging each other, doing every 3rd room or so as we worked our way along the corridor. As we were working, I hear one of my fellow coworkers scream out, "Oh my God," in Spanish. Obviously, the other 2 of us came running to see what was wrong. I remember arriving in the room, not being able to see what she was so freaked out about. The place was basically clean apart from one broken window, which was broken at the top of it. The window started about chest height, then went all the way up to the ceiling to let all this nice natural light into the room. It was only when I looked up because of this that I actually saw what she was so freaked out about. Leading up to the broken portion of the window, all across the ceiling, were dirty footprints, super visible against the pale paint. And the 2 of us that had come running were like, how in God's name did that happen? The poor Honduran lady we used to work with though was basically convinced it was a demon or something that had run along the ceiling before diving out the window. A much more logical explanation would be 2 heads fighting inside had somehow managed to leave some footprints on the ceiling after throwing each other around, then broken a window before running away. There was definitely no blood or anything to suggest that some kind of crazy accident had occurred though. I guess the really creepy thing was seeing how freaked out our coworker was. She kept clutching the cross around her neck and saying these little prayers to herself. She seriously thought something evil had been in there. We had to talk her down and explain that weirder things had happened when people were cranked out of their minds. She just wasn't buying it though. She refused to clean that room for the rest of the time I worked there. I cleaned it myself on many occasions, and nothing weird ever happened while I did so. I don't really know exactly how to explain what happened though. It's kinda crazy actually. This happened a couple of years ago, back when I was a dancer at a gentleman's club in Virginia. It was the most upscale place in the city, but it still more or less catered to the regular clientele. There was a man named George who used to come in and see me a couple of times every week. He would buy dances and VIP rooms and would always tip very well, while saying things like, "I can't believe you don't have a boyfriend," and "When are you gonna let me take you out to dinner?" The thing is, I did have a boyfriend. However, like my real name, my personal life is not anyone's business. Strip clubs are a fantasy environment. If these men knew I had a boyfriend and a life outside of dancing, they wouldn't be willing to pay nearly as much money as they did. One night I was getting dressed to leave, and I was excited to get home, as my boyfriend had just come back from a tour he was on. He's in a band, and he was waiting at home for me. The club closed at 2 a.m., so I usually walked out the door and to my car around 2:30 or so. Usually we have a bouncer that walks us out, but since it was a slow night, we only had one bouncer, who was still on the clock. He was off doing something else. I was in a real hurry to get home, so I just ran to my car all alone. As soon as I started up my car and turned out of the parking lot though, another car turned its lights on and pulled out right behind me. I didn't think too much of it at first and continued on my way home until I realized that every turn I made, that car followed exactly. They even followed me onto the highway and onto the same exit my boyfriend and I lived on. We lived on the outskirts of the city in a heavily wooded area where houses are pretty far and few between. So as soon as that car took the same exit down the gravel road that led to the area my house is in, I called my boyfriend. Now, my boyfriend was a really big guy and had a bad temper too. As soon as I pulled into our driveway with the other car still behind me, he ran out from behind his tour van with a baseball bat in tow and two of our dogs following close behind. He told me to stay in my car while he tried to see who was following me. Of course, we found out it was George. My boyfriend managed to hit the hood of his car with the bat before George could reverse back down the gravel road and disappear. I was scared, of course, because now he knew where I lived, but my boyfriend assured me there was going to be nothing to worry about anymore. I had a feeling he would adequately deter George from ever coming back. I mean, I guess a huge tattooed guy with a baseball bat and two big dogs was a pretty good deterrent in itself. I told my managers at work about the incident the next day, and they banned George from the club. A couple of months later, he tried to come in anyway, but the bouncer stopped him. His only explanation was that he thought I didn't have a boyfriend. Every now and then, you have to look back and wonder about things in your life, how it may have gone differently if we knew the results our actions would have. Everything might be so much better, choosing what actions would make the best outcomes, but instead everyone makes mistakes, and everyone suffers the consequences of those mistakes. I grew up in a fairly uncomfortable environment. My parents got divorced when I was really young. Us kids ended up being with our dad, not because he was a good parent or anything, but because he was the only one with a job and a place to live. He was quite substandard as a parent, actually. He got very lost in the alcohol. It was sweet, and he was bad at paying his bills as well. As a result, we ended up moving quite often. Whenever he'd neglected to pay rent for months on end, we'd have to move every time. We had no stability at all. When I was 15 years old, I met a boy named Todd, who was in a remarkably similar situation to me, only for him it was his mother. She was the worst parent. He lived with his brother, and the few times I was over at his house, I saw firsthand just how awful she was. We were both miserable, so one day when he was taking me for a ride in his Mustang, the song Fast Car by Tracy Chapman came on the radio. I guess we were both so miserable in our lives we decided to do it and just run away right then. We gathered some brief belongings and some money and decided we were gonna drive out to Chicago. I guess I could bog you down with the details, Hell, I could write a novel about it if I wanted to. All I can say is the trip was alright, and we did make it to Chicago in the end. However, we quickly learned that being able to find a job at 15 and 16 years old was a lot more difficult than it seemed. Also, his car was bought and paid for completely, but being 16 years old, it was not in his name. It was a present from his father, so it wasn't like his mother could report it stolen. The point being, we couldn't get any money for the car in any way. We had a hotel room at a really ratty hotel in the city, and after a few days of us not being able to pay for the room, Todd felt he had to do something in order to get us some money. One day he went out, and he was gone for a very long time. When he came back, he was visibly exhausted. I tried to get some information out of him, but he wouldn't tell me anything. He always changed the subject while we ate, then watched some television together. This continued for about a week and a half. Todd would go out during the day and come back looking completely worn down. He would always have food though, and a little bit of money as well, just enough to keep us going. One day, I told Todd we had some money to last us a few days, and he should take a day off from whatever it was he was doing. I'd go out and buy us some food instead. He was hard to convince, but eventually I did convince him to do it. He gave me some cash, and I went on my way. I was out of the hotel room for about 3 hours. I had to find a grocery store and get there, get the food, and come back. I felt really good about myself. I'd finally done something for Todd, who had done the world for me at that point. I came into the motel room, only to drop the groceries on the floor. Todd was laying in the bed. His throat had been cut completely open. His eyes stared blankly into nothingness, and there was blood all over the place. I ran down to call the hotel office and got them to call the police. It was a nightmare. I mean, an absolute nightmare. I couldn't believe what just happened. Just a few hours beforehand, I had been feeling on top of the world, thinking I could let my best friend rest well. I tried to do something nice for him, and in that short period of time, he was brutally murdered in the room I'd slept with him in all along. I was sent back home to my dad. Todd's parents were called soon after. There was an investigation, of course, but the case is cold, and Todd has been left with no trail. As to what sort of job he was doing to get that money, the only person who knew him in the city was me, and I didn't know anything. Todd was a teenage runaway, whose death got lost in the annals of teenage runaways. I always assumed whatever he was doing for money, it must have been something illegal. I wonder if I'd stayed home that night, would he still be alive? But I have a feeling we'd both be dead instead. I feel responsible for my friend being murdered. I don't have any answers to these questions, but I spent my life being an advocate for resources for teens who run away from home. I hope that maybe some teenagers hearing this story will decide against running away. Your life may be miserable now, but it can get a whole lot worse. If you do run away, go to a shelter. Don't do anything illegal. The world's a lot scarier than you think it is, I promise you. I miss you, Todd. That's all I can say to you. That plus, I'm sorry. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.